you're going to invest in a fund, but this fund is going to own peatlands, sphagnum moss, rewiggled rivers. It's going to restore farmland. It's going to own oyster reefs. It's basically from source to sea. It's going to own a portfolio of everything that you've talked about on this podcast, Ben.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World, and I've got Rob Gardner here, a founder and chief executive of Rebalance Earth. Thanks for joining me, Rob.
Ben, great to be on. I'm such a huge fan, so I'm quite excited.
On this podcast, we come back again and again to the question of how we're going to pay for rewilding at the kind of scale it needs to happen. Often that's about governments aligning incentives towards nature restoration, the Environmental Land Management Scheme. Sometimes it's about things like biodiversity credits or voluntary carbon credits. Rob, you've developed a whole new idea that doesn't involve really much goodwill at all. You don't need government to do your solution. You don't need people to do this out of the goodness of their hearts. You've potentially stumbled across a way to do nature restoration at scale, and it all revolves around water. I think you said in our first meeting, you kind of fix water, you sort of answer all questions. What is this big Rebalance Earth idea, Rob?
Well, it's actually to do with how do we raise £100 billion. So let's say if we took the British Isles, it probably needs £100 billion over the next decade. That is a big number. So where's that going to come from? So I've actually just come back from Edinburgh and the big annual pensions conference, not something that people go to. But this is important because in that room was £5 trillion. So across all the different defined benefit pension schemes, final salary, defined contribution, which probably what most people are on, local government pension schemes, and wealth is £5 trillion. And most people won't realise is that the UK is the second largest pool of sort of pensions and wealth in the world. And just to give you one other number, in the next 10 years, 5 trillion is going to become 10 trillion. And so the argument I make to those pension funds is if you just make a 2% allocation to nature, 2% of 5 trillion is £100 billion. So the money is there. And so the argument is, how am I going to convince you, Ben, to spend £2 of every £100 on restoring nature? And I need to convince you, if you were a trustee of one of those pension funds, that it's good for the resilience of your portfolio, this idea called portfolio resilience. So you invest in other stuff. So why is investing in nature good for everything else you do? Second of all, how can you make money from it? So I need to demonstrate it's an investable asset class. You already invest in real estate. You already invest in infrastructure, onshore wind, offshore wind. So how can I show that you get paid for these ecosystem services? And we can double click on that a bit more. And then the third thing is that these pension funds do want to have this idea of what I call a world worth living in. There's no point in investing their members' money. And then I think, Ben, you and I are similar age. If we retire and basically 25 years from now, the world is trashed, what's the point of having a retirement income? So if we can answer all three of those questions, they are very open-minded to invest.
So the conversation you have with these big institutional investors that are sitting on 5 trillion is we want you to invest 2% of that 5 trillion directly into the restoration of nature, in the same way that they would invest in, the building of student accommodation. Society has a need for student accommodation. If these pension funds invest in that student accommodation, they're going to make an investment return. They're going to get a yield back from that student accommodation, and they'll be able to pay out their pensioners each year, which is what they're there to do. Same applies to solar PV or bridges or toll roads or water infrastructure. What you're proposing is that nature, broadly defined, is infrastructure just like any of those things.
That is our tagline.
So how do you convince, so the pension fund manager comes to the table, sits down with you and says, okay, I'm open-minded about investing in nature. The stakeholders in our pension fund want us to do more in the way of nature investing. What exactly are you asking them to put their money into? And then how exactly are they going to get a return on that money that they've invested?
Yeah, so the structure will look very similar to a property fund where they invest and they own supermarket stores, distribution centers, data centers with long leases. Or it will look very similar to infrastructure investments where they're maybe investing in onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, and they have what's called offtake agreements for the production of power. So they're basically being asked to invest in typically a fund, a closed-end fund for about 15 years, where normally they would, let's say, build a wind farm. that produces energy, they get paid for that energy, and that's how they make their rate of return. I now need to say, you're going to invest in a fund, but this fund is going to own peatlands, sphagnum moss, rewiggled rivers. It's going to restore farmland. It's going to own oyster reefs. It's basically from source to sea. It's going to own a portfolio of everything that you've talked about on this podcast, Ben, from salt marsh to oysters to river restoration. It will own all of those things. All of those generate ecosystem services, natural flood management. They help with drought. They help clean the water. Cleaning the water is really important, as well as biodiversity and carbon. And therefore, our job as a fund manager is to originate those opportunities and collect the rent, let's say, in simple terms, for those ecosystem services. But it's quite different from credits and offsets.
So how do you actually own a reef, an oyster reef or a peat bog? I mean, obviously, you've got landowners when it's on land. If it's the inshore marine environment, it's the Crown Estate owns that real estate. How does the fund that these institutions are investing into, how does it come to own those assets?
Well, we're going to lease them. So I think that's the first point. We're not looking to buy up lots of land, which I know is a model that other people have. And by the way, if you want to put, if someone wants to come to you and say, hey, can I put a wind farm on your land? They might lease a small section of your farm to do that. So an oyster reef is a lease, let's say, from the Crown Estate. Or, if you want to do kelp, again, it's probably a lease from the Crown Estate. The bit that we will probably own and fund is laying these kind of clay bricks, pre-impregnated with oysters, where we are financing the survival of those oysters. And if we can restore a healthy oyster reef, that then has a whole load of ecosystem services. The three that we think are really valuable is one is restoring biodiversity, which is important for restoring fish stock in the North Sea. And maybe we can talk about why that's valuable. The second is cleaning water. I mean, oysters clean 200 litres of water a day per oyster. And the third thing is coastal erosion. They dissipate wave energy by about 70%. So if you're building something really valuable, a nuclear power station on the coast, some well-placed oyster reefs might be very valuable.
Okay, so and I should have mentioned at the start, you've already had a big slug of investment from West Yorkshire Pension Fund. How much money did you get in from them?
So they've invested in us as a business, and they own 25%. I can't disclose how much they invested, but that's allowed us to build the team. But what they have also done is they will invest 25 million in our new fund. And we're going to be launching our fund later this year with 150 million. And they've said that if we can get to 100 million, they'll put another 25 million in. And so that money allows us to start working on some of these projects and turning the idea into reality.
It's amazing that you've got this far, and that's proper money now. So going back to this oyster example, so you negotiate a lease with the Crown Estate. You then take some of that money that's been invested in your fund and you invest it in these clay bricks and the little baby oysters. And we all know about re-oystering. There's wonderful re-oystering projects happening off the west coast of Scotland. You've got massive re-oystering happening around New York City. Those little oysters then grow up. How do you then go about getting people to pay for the good things that oyster reef is going to do, the three things that you mentioned?
So this is where I suppose we probably differ from a lot of nature restoration, which starts with the nature restoration and says, who wants to buy it? We talked about this beforehand, but the 4 returns framework, which is this excellent framework for kind of landscape level restoration, and we flipped it on its head. So we start with the demand side. So what's the financial rate of return? Then what's the natural return? Third, what's the social return? Do we create new jobs? Do we, make it a nicer place to live? And finally, what's the inspirational rate of return? If we do this, how does this become like the Rocket Railway? How does this become an exemplar to inspire others to do more? And so every deal that we look at, we've created almost like a top trumps, but the first thing is the off-taker. So we spend most of our time not on can we secure the lease or how do we do this? We say which company needs to pay for this and why. And I just want to mention a guy called Julius Persay who works for Cushion National Trust. He said to me 2 things, Rob. He said, one, when you set up this business, whatever you do, don't raise money from venture capital, raise money from long-term aligned investors, right? Like West Yorkshire Pension Fund. Their time horizon is decades, is over 100 years. So that's point one. Point two, he said, if you can find a way to get companies to pay for nature because they want to and need to, not because they're told to, then you massively de-risk this. Because the risk is a new political party comes in and rips up BNG and it all falls away. So if you can prove to me that companies want to pay for this stuff because they want to and need to, that will unlock a lot. So pet food is an incredibly valuable business line. It doesn't matter whether you're Mars or Nestle or General Mills or the rest. Like, who knew that for Mars or Nestle, they make more money from pet food than from coffee or chocolate?
I did, by the way, because I'm friends with a young American guy who's studying in London, who's a member of the Mars family. And he told me, to my disgust, that when he joined the family business, he put in the pet food division, and they made him taste the pet food as part of his kind of initiation. And he told me that all the pet foods are tasted by humans.
Well, so there's this framework that got released about a year ago, which is called TNFD, which stands for the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. But what this means is that we've lived under a kind of global economic system in our lifetime, Ben, where you can build a company, grow a company, get the revenues and costs, create market value with very little regard for negative externalities. And what's happened over the last few years is people have tried to put these regulations in to say, let's recognize these negative externalities. What TNFD does is gets a company or an asset owner, like the pension funds I've been speaking to up in Edinburgh, to say, hang on a minute, Mars, hang on a minute, Nestle, hang on a minute, General Mills, what nature-related risks are you dependent on, or do you have a negative impact on, and what are you doing about it? But if I told you that, so if coffee and chocolate isn't the most profitable business line, but it's pet food, and half of that comes from the UK and Europe, we're talking about billions of dollars in revenue and profit being dependent on what bit of nature do you think we need for pet food? Well, it's fish in the North Sea. And what's happened to fish in the North Sea, Ben, in the last 50 years?
Collapse.
So if you're CFO of one of these businesses, you've got to ask yourself, to what extent do I have a business 10 years from now? So this is not some kind of corporate social responsibility. So you probably, I don't have pets, but if you go into the supermarket, you'll notice that, Mars talk about how they want to restore thousands of hectares of coral reefs. Nestle Purina have also made these declarations. They might look like marketing declarations, but actually the health of the marine environment from which they source their product is financially material.
Now, it's similar to the example that the EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, gave when she talked about natural capital last year. She used the example of fruit businesses. She says if you're growing large amounts of fruit, then you're pretty keen on pollinating insects in the areas where you're growing that fruit. And therefore, it makes perfect sense for those fruit businesses to invest in the restoration of nature and habitats surrounding their fruit farms, because then they'll get all the pollinating insects coming in and pollinating those fruit trees. I guess it's a very similar example.
It is. What's happened is that we've not recognized it, and it's only been in the last very recent times that people are recognizing these ecosystem services. So we exist in a Horizon 1 business where the value of nature is zero. Nature's worth more dead than alive. We have this extractive model. We need to move to a Horizon 3 model where we kind of have a nature first model, where nature is integrated into our economy, where we think about biophilic cities. And then the model that we've built is a kind of Horizon 2 model, which is like, how do we create that Fosbury flop? How do we flip the script so that people start to say, I pay for Wi-Fi, so I'm quite happy to pay BT to build infrastructure to charge me for Wi-Fi. Well, we're saying, well, why wouldn't you pay for us to restore nature, create ecosystem services, and we'll collect the rent for that?
So how does the conversation go then with potential off-takers of the services that your new oyster reef is going to generate?
So the first thing that we do is do a huge amount of sort of desktop analysis of by industry, who's exposed, utilities, transportation, so railways, roads, airports, supermarkets, fast-moving consumer goods companies. And then we need to know more about these companies and their nature-related risks than they do. And so we've built a map where we can model what all the CSOs, which are these kind of sewage overflows for United Utilities, We then cross-reference that with all the flood events for Network Rail, and then we cross-reference that with all the flood events for Electricity Northwest and all the substations. And then we've built this tool, which is like Zoopla for nature, that allows us to go, what are the nature-based solutions that we can invest in that solves a problem for all three of them? And then it's now our job to build a financial model where we can kind of connect those dots.
So I want to come on to flooding and flood resilience, but before we do, so when it comes to oyster reefs, you will look to find companies that have direct exposure to the health of the North Sea, and you'll ask them to voluntarily make a contribution to the restoration work you're doing in the North Sea.
Well, it's not. Yeah, they're paying for it because it has business resilience. It's not a marketing. So there's sort of philanthropy. There's sort of marketing ESG. Our core thing is resilience through nature, and so it's resilience to if you're reliant on fish, but the water. Do not underestimating what most water companies in the UK. If they're creating pollution on the near shoreline because the rivers are full of pollutants, they're on the hook for cleaning that up. And plan A is to build an expensive water treatment plant with all the embodied carbon that needs electricity or needs energy and needs chemicals to clean it up. And we say, well, we think an oyster reef can do this for a lot less. A bit like Adam was saying, the cost per acre is a lot cheaper. Why don't we build that reef for you and we'll charge that service to you?
And what I meant by voluntarily is, so no one will force them to do that, but they will come to understand that investing in that resilience ultimately is going to save them money and it's going to protect their business model into the future. A bit like the historic deal between the city of Bogota and SAB Miller, the brewing company. I think they make Corona beer and other beer brands. And SAB Miller, they wrote at the time, cottoned on to the idea that if there were water shortages in Bogota region, the city was going to win out over the beer company and their business model would be stuffed. So they went to the city and said, why don't we invest together in the restoration of cloud forests for tens of thousands of acres around the city and thereby secure water for both citizens and for us, the beer company. And that partnership, I think, was brokered by the Nature Conservancy and has been an enormous success. So it's a similar idea. No one forced them to do it. They just recognized that it was going to make their business more resilient.
Correct.
So how have those conversations been received specifically in relation to these oyster reefs? Have you had those conversations already with corporations that might have an interest?
Yeah, no, we have. And there are multiple user cases. As I say, there's the biodiversity benefit, there's the clean the water benefit, and then there's also the coastal erosion benefit.
So let's talk about flooding, because that's what we talked about when I met you for coffee not so long ago. And the idea that you pitched to me that you've been working on is one whereby you take a river catchment, say the Derwent or the River Plym by Plymouth, and you identify all the high-value infrastructure assets that exist within that river catchment, which, of course, when they flood, they suffer damage. But worse than that, they're then offline for a period of time. And if a small airport or a logistics hub or electricity substation is offline for a few days, that's disastrous for the operator. So your proposition, if I remember it correctly, was to go to all of those asset owners and say, if you collectively agree to pay an annual amount of money for the service of greater flood resilience, we will then use that to secure a capital investment in order to restore the catchment. So where are you at on that?
Yeah, so the live conversations are with Plymouth City Council. So, your example about SAB Miller and Bogota of like, it's aligning interests, right? So Plymouth City Council have got flood defences built to 1 in 30-year standards. What most listeners won't probably know is that the Environment Agency and DEFRA have just updated all their flood models to reflect current kind of climate change and weather conditions. And there's been a 10x shift in flood risk. So a 1 in 30-year flood now happens every 3 years. And in Plymouth and on this industrial estate in Marsh Mills, which is where all these kind of high-value supermarkets and industrial estates are, they've basically experienced one of those 1 in 30-year floods every year for the last 5 years. And the issue they have is their insurance is going up 15% a year. And so they're sat there saying, well, do we move our supermarket, our factory? Yeah, if you're someone like Princess Yachts, you were founded there, you've been there, all your employees are there. It's not easy to just sort of get up and move your business. For Sainsbury's, it's their third largest Sainsbury's in the whole of the UK. It makes about $1 million a week. But the real risk isn't the damage of the flooding, i.e. I need to repaint my factory, I need to replace my stock. It's the fact that if I can't do business for 2 weeks, I've lost 4% of my year. I've potentially lost 4% of my revenues. Typically, that's uninsurable risk. And on a forward-looking basis, that looks like it could double in the next 10 years. That could happen 8% of the time. What that allows you to do is calculate what's called revenues at risk. So what percentage of my revenues do I think I might lose if I can't fix this? And yes, you're right. Our job is to then go up catchment and identify what are a portfolio of nature-based solutions. So it's not one. It will be restoring of peatlands. It will be rewiggling of parts of the river plim. It will be working with farmers to farm differently and adopt regen ag, not just for soil carbon, but actually for the water, the carrying capacity. And our job is to be able to aggregate that and show how much water can we store and slow down and potentially clean. And that's what the fund owns. And then it's our job to then go and collect the rent from that and go, well, how much is that worth to Princess Yachts? How much is that worth to Sainsbury's? How much is that worth to the Highways Agency or National Highways? How much is that worth to Network Rail, etc.? And build a financial model which doesn't look any different to the financial model that was used to build a shopping centre in Westfield.
So is there not a free rider problem, though? If I'm sitting there as a managing director of a logistics hub that's at risk from flooding the River Plim, and I know that you're having these conversations with all these other asset owners, there might be a devilish part of me that thinks they're going to do this anyway. Why should I pay? I might just sit this one out and I'll get the benefit. So how do you overcome that free rider problem and get everyone signed up? And if everyone is signing up, how do you figure out who pays what? That's on the revenue at risk model.
So yeah, normally people talk about either mandating people to do stuff or they talk about polluter pays. Actually, this model's slightly different. This is beneficiary pays. And you're right, the easiest way to kind of figure out how much you pay is calibrated to your kind of revenues at risk. That's the kind of fairest way. First of all, I think in the financial model, we accept there's going to be a degree of free rider, but we do need to get, is that 60%, is that 80% to buy in? And this is where we do need to work closely with the local authority. So in this case, Plymouth City Council, in Manchester, we work with Greater Manchester Combined Authority to kind of lean on these people. But what's interesting is businesses at a local level actually help each other far more than you might think in the kind of big bad global world. On the sort of facilities manager or the MD on the ground, like if we were living each other and I needed some milk, I'm pretty sure I could knock on your door and you'd give me some milk, you'd help me out. Actually, at a local level, businesses help each other out. And so far, we found that the other businesses have said, let me introduce you to Ben, let me introduce you to James, and actually connect that up to make it work. So we've kind of reverse engineered it the other way around and said, what's the minimum number of companies we need to get signed up in order to make this work and get the sort of city council to sort of put some soft pressure behind the scenes to encourage them to take part.
Okay, so you get all these asset owners to commit to say, I don't know, just to pick a random number, £5 million a year that they're willing to pay in exchange for you investing in the entire river catchment and build much greater flood resilience into the whole area, thereby theoretically reducing the risk that they're going to be offline for chunks of time. You've then got your fund, which is then able then to go ahead and invest because you know that you've got 5 million of revenues that are going to give you the return on that investment. What do you actually do with the money? So let's say I'm a landowner in that catchment. You then come knocking on my door with your checkbook open. What's a conversation with me like?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a conversation that's happened before that, which is exactly. So we have stakeholder meetings all the time with the landowners. So it's then who are the primary landowners? In this case, Plymouth City Council does own a lot of the land, National Trust, MOD. There are various large landowners. And so it's, here's what we're planning to do. Here's what we need to do. We'd love to restore the river through part of your land, Ben. Actually, if you look back, probably not that long ago, probably when your grandfather farmed it, the river used to go that way. We will pay you, of course, we're leasing the land, so it's still your land. That's important. But we want you to give up a portion of your land to allow us to restore the river. We will pay you, let's say, either a per hectare fixed amount, but all of a sudden that's guaranteed income with no costs, no pesticides, no fertilizers. You just let the river do its thing. It's going to move into dynamic equilibrium. Or we can say we're going to be generating these ecosystem services. There are some other ones and you can participate in that. Do you want to have a revenue share? So it's a conversation. The goal is to sort of pinpoint the largest landowners where we can have the biggest effect. So clearly, engaging people like National Trust is incredibly important. And actually creating the buy-in as to why it's good. And I think the third thing, Ben, is that we're actually, by doing this, probably reducing risk to the rest of their farmland as well. So there's that benefit as well that you need to kind of land.
I mean, it's just game-changing, really, because all the rewilding projects and, for example, the river restoration projects that we see on our social media that lift up our hearts, Mike Blackmore was on the podcast from Wessex Rivers Trust, and the work that he's doing is mostly paid for by those individuals that are kind enough to give money to the Wessex Rivers Trust. The government, of course, now has its environmental land management scheme, and which is an enormously good result for the country, and money is now being directed towards restoration. But the sums are not huge, and of course, it's being opened and closed. It sort of stops and starts, and it's not yet perfect. It's a massive win, and I'm a huge fan of the environmental land management scheme. But governments can't necessarily be relied upon. Who do we how do we know that government in 2 years' time or 5 years' time is going to continue funding that? So this idea that you can bypass all of that, you can bypass philanthropy and charity and bypass government and set up a direct stakeholder model where you're raising money from those who benefit from the service of the rewilding, potentially can unleash massive, unprecedented sums of money for landscape restoration.
Yeah, and there's another bit, is that the value of that nature restoration, the context of its value is in place. And pension funds like what's called place-based investing. So the Greater Manchester Pension Fund has a preference to invest in the Greater Manchester catchment. The pension funds that all form part of the sort of Brunel, which is kind of the southwest, obviously want to invest in Wiltshire or Cornwall or Devon. And, the West Yorkshire Pension Fund has more of an interest in investing in Leeds and Bradford. One of the goals that the West Yorkshire Pension Fund has is sustainable cities and communities. So there are all these other knock-on benefits, which if we do this, we actually reduce risk to people's homes in Plymouth. We reduce risk that the bus can't operate. Like, people just can't get to work because the roads are flooded. So there are all of these other things. And it just makes it a nicer place to live as well, right? So there's a lot of intangible value that can be unlocked in all of this. And then, hopefully people get more and more confident about nature-based prescription for mental health and physical well-being. And we'll never be able to reclaim the financial benefit of that. But for the councils who get it, then again, this is a great way of creating a much nicer environment for everyone.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. And there's parallels in other countries. I had Adam Davis from Ecosystem Investment Partners on the podcast, and I mean, the scale of the rewilding projects that they're doing in the lower 48 states of the USA are just unbelievable. I mean, tens of thousands of acres of salt marsh restoration and freshwater wetlands and all kinds of things. And they're doing that through a fund that is generating 12, 14% investment returns for their investors, albeit those projects, as far as I can make out, typically operate under government-funded mitigation markets. So the state of Florida has got a problem with phosphates and nitrates, and so they then contract with EIP to restore a massive wetland. Or the state of California has got a problem under the Endangered Species Act and needs to create new habitat for whatever it is, flathead or steelhead fish, and so they contract with the IP to do that. But it's a similar idea, and this does seem to be popping up all over the world now. Pakistan has just done the world's largest mangrove restoration of Sindh province, Karachi, all funded using voluntary carbon markets. But the solidity of what you're proposing here in the UK, where you're actually cross-referencing the revenues at risk with the cost of making the ecosystem restoration take place, I think it's the most exciting rewilding financing story I've heard. Rob, before you started Rebalance Earth, what were you doing? I mean, how did you get to do this? I forget. I think you were a financier or a banker, because I seem to remember we met before you set up Rebalance Earth.
Yeah, look, I mean, if I go right back, I was a geographer. So, I was born in Holland. So I was born below sea level and have lived all over the world. My parents taught in many countries, which meant I went to study geography and specifically hydrology and glaciology. But I started my career in the city. And then 19 years ago, I founded a pensions consultancy called Reddington. So I've really spent over 20 years advising pension funds and insurance companies, mostly in the UK and Europe, on how to invest their assets to meet their long-term liabilities. And I was early into what is now probably seen a backlash, but ESG. I was early into what's called responsible investing. And it was just this idea that these negative externalities, climate change, nature loss, haven't been priced in. And how can financial markets, how can asset owners be used to be a force for good? And then I was on the executive board of St. James's Place, where I was running about 150 billion in assets. So, on behalf of 1 million clients, we had shares in Nestle, BP, Shell, JP Morgan, the full works, and sat there going, what are the negative externalities, not over the next 3 years or 5 years? Everyone cares about sort of tracking error. But if we're thinking about being an asset owner or a universal asset owner, what happens to future financial returns? And yeah, basically a friend of mine sent me a photo of the glacier that I'd worked on that has basically disappeared by about 50 to 60%. I've got young daughters, and I thought, I've got to go all in and try and fix this problem. And I understand asset classes and investments and this idea of like what makes something an asset class. And I thought, well, how can I combine finance and geography? And so I basically get to do a geography field trip every week and do finance. So it doesn't get any better.
And where do you get your nature fix, Rob?
All over. I mean, this is, sometimes we're up in Plymouth, sometimes we're up in Dovestone, in Norfolk, oyster reefs or Tayvallic. The UK has wonderful geography to explore. And then, of course, I do like to go on holiday, but I actually just love the variety of it. And actually, the thing that I love, one of the things we started at work is just called Nature in the City, which is what are little pockets of nature that are just hidden behind a church or by London Wall, which people who've worked there for 20 years don't even know it's there. And like, how can we kind of showcase that even in urban environments, we can unlock stuff? And I suppose that is something that I'm passionate about. We are 8 billion people. We are probably nearly closer to 70 million people living on these islands that we live on, British Isles, which is how do we, this kind of idea of biophilic design, how can we integrate towns and cities with nature? How can they coexist rather than nature's something that happens over here and cities that happen over there? And one of the best examples of that is Mayfield Park in Manchester, where they removed the culverts of the river, I think it's the River Irwell, and unlocked it. And it's the most incredible natural flood management that protects it, but it's a park and it has so much value, but people have no idea that this little enclave of nature, this little river restoration in the middle of a massive metropolitan area is actually this super sophisticated natural flood management.
Yeah, Isabella Tree, author of Wilding, she talks so well in her book about the importance of weaving nature back through the fabric of our built environment. This idea, as you say, that humans live over here and nature's over there is completely wrong. And I think it's a birthright or perhaps a social justice thing that if you're not rich or rural, it's assumed that you just won't have access to nature and wildlife. And yet we know that we really need, on a visceral level, to have regular contact with nature. And it's kind of a birthright. I mean, if you're a kid born in the centre of London or Manchester, you've got just as much right to experience nature in your day-to-day life as someone who lives in the wilds of South Somerset, which is where I'm sitting right now, looking at a kestrel, which is eyeing me up from the tree opposite the window. Yeah, I think we live in really exciting times, but as ever, the biggest issue is money. How are we going to incentivize landowners to just open up their land to all this kind of restoration? How are we going to get big sums of money to flow? And when we say big sums of money, it doesn't compare with the big sums of money that are needed to deal with the global health crisis or the global energy transition. Or these are orders of magnitude bigger. Fixing nature isn't that expensive as compared with other things. No, nature does just want to fix itself, and we just have to kind of take our foot off its throat. And so if you can pull this off with Rebalance Earth and get some demonstration projects funded in a way, I think you shift the whole paradigm. So I'm so excited to chat to you, Rob. Again, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. I'd love it if my friends in Nattergal, where I'm involved, are able to work with you as well. I know that they're fans of Rebalance Earth. Thank you for taking the time.
Ben, thank you for having us on board, and I am confident that we will be working with Nattergal at some point in the future.
Conversations like the one I've just had with Rob Gardner really make me believe that we can find the money that's needed to rewild at scale. I'm going to be following the progress of Rebalance Earth very closely. If you enjoyed the episode as much as I enjoyed making it, please give us a like or a share on whatever platform you use. And we're now on YouTube. If you look up Rewilding the World, you'll find clips and the best parts of these podcasts there on YouTube. Next time, I'm going to be talking to Katie Mosher from New York City's awesome, ambitious billion oyster restoration project. New York City was once completely surrounded by oyster beds. They were all destroyed, and Katie and her team are now putting them back together oyster by oyster. I hope you'll join us.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about a series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.